can hear me again. Good morning, everyone. This is Mike Lane with the Illinois Land Title Association. I want to welcome you to our Anti-Predatory Lending Database webinar. Today, we are featuring two presenters to help cover this important and timely program. We have Maitza Anaya, who is First American Title Insurance Company Illinois Escrow Advisor, and Brian Wojcicki, who is ILTA's Government Relations expert, and the two of them will be covering this program this morning. This one's a little different than ones we've had in the past, in as much as throughout the program, you may have an opportunity to send in questions or comments that will be addressed as we go through the program. You'll see you have a questions box on your screen that you should be able to type that in there to that. I also want to mention that our next regularly scheduled webinar is October 15th, which will be the third installment of our Title Traps program that we've had two before. They've been well attended, and this one will be sponsored by Equest Title. Also, be watching for your email. We're going to be doing, if you're a fan of TED Talks, we are introducing ILTA Talks and little short 2-3 minute video broadcasts from many of the leaders of ILTA about things that are on their mind, how they're dealing with the whole issues of this COVID and where it's all going and what it means to their businesses. So be watching for that. So with that, again, welcome. And with this time, I'll turn it over to Brian and Maitza to begin our program.
Thanks, Mike. This is Brian Wojcicki, handle government relations for ILTA. I'll be starting our programming, and Maitza will be handling kind of some of the more practical aspects of things to look out for and how to handle APLD issues that have come up. I'll cover some of the background and how we got here information. And also, I think some of the reality of the background of the issues that we've been seeing may also set the foundation for conversations that need to take place in the future with regards to the statute and the regulations related to them. So some of the basic foundation for this, obviously, we are happy for anyone who joined us, but the reality is these are issues for transactions in Cook County, Kane, Peoria, and Will counties. It was in May of 2005, actually, that this APLD issue in legislative form started. I happened to be working legislative issues at the time, and I raised some of this background only because I'm sure there are those, anytime that there's a frustration with the statute, there's questions of why don't we change it or get rid of it? And I would point out that for whatever reason, I distinctly remember the fireworks at the end of session on this issue in 2005. In particular, it involved a higher level of foreclosures in a certain legislator's district. That legislator is currently the House Speaker. I would suggest that the statute or the APLD not going away anytime soon. So some of what we'll be working on is how best to comply now and work on some of the ambiguities that we maybe need to look at in the future. 2008 is when Cook County officially got fully in place. It started off with just certain sectors of Cook County, but by July of 2008, all of Cook County, and then you'll see by July of 2010, Kane, Peoria, and Will counties became part of the APLD world. The regulator over all of this is IDFPR, Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, in particular the division of banking, which is a little unique to the title universe, given that the division of financial institutions is who many of you all would maybe be interacting with more, with the APLD being under the division of banking. There are certainly some different staff and others in the regulatory structure that we deal with, but the reality is this is over or under IDFBR's jurisdiction. And they've laid out a lot of the basics as best they can with regards to the database. And as the statute lays out, there's really only 3 groups that interact with that database. You'll see in particular the final dot point is something that's going to be touched on in this webinar in many different ways, is the reliance on brokers and originators. And as the statute explicitly lays out, the database was authorized to allow for brokers and originators to populate the information, or at least some of the initial information in the database itself that the title industry then can interact with. One of the other aspects that we're seeing as more enforcement warnings and other audit actions are taking place is there's really 2 categories of main responsibilities. One of them is whether or not you are dealing with a certificate of compliance or a certificate of exemption. In the database, and as Moitza will be going through it, I put there in quotes application. A lot of times the reference to a certificate of compliance may be synonymous with a reference to an application. The quoted statutory language references this responsibility of the title industry, but also I think it'll be important for at least some to recognize what is clearly an explicit phrase that the department seems to have picked up on that maybe is not always getting done, is being cognizant of the form needing to be a form, quote, generated by the database. And so while corrections of errors or resubmissions certainly are not prohibited, the concept of altering a form is something the department appears to have been seeing and been asking questions about. So just keep that in mind, that is something explicitly in the statute with regards to using a form generated by the database. The department also tries to lay out in their overview some of the basics, and Moitza is going to be getting into the practical realities of what to look for, where to look, and in terms of the type of property or the type of entities involved, and as to whether or not they're exempt on their overview page. I know we have the department on as well, and so I would maybe like to point out for them, as the title industry interacts with some of these things, in the statute involving the APLD, the dot points on exempt property involving non-owner occupied commercial property, residential property, more than 4 units, and government property. In the title industry, the term commercial property, while certainly utilized, that term doesn't actually show up in the Title Act. And so as the regulator and the industry interact, it's certainly going to be important for when these questions come up, a recognition that there's a reason that a question may come up. And so, that may be an area that needs to be looked at in the future, because commercial property is a term in one statute, but not the other. The other point on government property is in the FAQs that'll be linked later in this webinar. the department tries to highlight in their FAQ that the reference to government property is a reference to use for government offices or government functions, as opposed to being for example, HUD property or HUD finance property. And the final dot point with regards to exempt entities, which we'll be touching on more and will be a large part of, frankly, this webinar, where there are areas of confusion, has to do with entities not subject to the Act. And so these will be the forms that many in the title industries are submitting that the department more recently has been red flagging. The background on this, and frankly, the other area of importance to recognize for the industry outside of determining whether it's a certificate of compliance or exemption, is the accuracy. The second main thing is the accuracy of the information. It's a responsibility that the department, you'll see in the first dot point, is very much highlighting in their recent notices from May and July. When they're requesting a certificate of exemption, it's the responsibility of the person requesting to ensure the quote accuracy of the information. A lot of that, or some of that, certainly deals with reliance on your interactions with the broker and originator community. It's certainly something to keep in mind, as some of you maybe get asked questions about how to help someone who's a friend, colleague, or someone you have a good business relationship with in the broker and originator community who is asking for help. In the FAQs and linked here, the department tries to highlight as explicitly as they can that mortgage banks and mortgage loan originators licensed by IDFPR are not exempt. A link and list that Moitza will be highlighting that can be useful to verify if somebody's on that list, and by being on that list not being exempt, the department actually provides a couple links, but in more recent interactions with them have highlighted their mortgage bank list more so than others. And at the end of the FAQ, and part of the reason we're here on the webinar today, is naturally the fact that they also highlight in their FAQ that violations or inaccurate information or improperly submitted exemptions are considered violations, and in particular the Title Insurance Act. And so we are obviously, I think, all aware of some more cease and desist orders and audits that have been getting requested in the industry. So whether or not interactions were the best over the last 10 years, we're certainly in an opportunity now to have some more interaction with the department, and it certainly should be encouraged to try and work through compliance. Although we'll be touching on it, and it's certainly important to recognize accuracy information doesn't just apply to whether or not there's an exemption. There is also a responsibility with regards to the compliance, the applications itself. The statute in the first dot point on this slide, or the first sub dot point on the slide, points out that there's a statutory list of information that the title industry is responsible for, and some of that certainly is something that we all rely on from the brokers and originators. The last dot point from the FAQs and overview by the department does try to emphasize why or where some of the accurate information is important. That I emphasized, based on the overview that IDFPR provided, at least in a couple areas, would be looking for if there are change in loan terms that trigger new housing counseling standards. And then the other after that was for increasing the interest rate by more than 200 basis points. So from what the broker originator inputted into the form versus what would be getting checked, this is at least one aspect that IDFPR is highlighting in their overview of the database for the title industry. The foundation of the APLD and the floor debate by the legislators very much highlighted the concept of if and when an individual may need housing counseling was one of, if not the foundational element of the formation of the APLD at the beginning and middle of the foreclosure crisis. So the reliance on brokers and originators is certainly something not to be lost. Obviously, the highlight here today is compliance by the title industry, but there's a reality of that relationship. And it's certainly sensitive, and there's many times that the transactions that you all may be having is based on the good relations that you may have in the financial industry. But there are certainly responsibilities that as an association we're going to be trying to listen for, and we hope that we take advantage of this period to share some of the interactions you're having, because there may not just be confusion on the title end, there may be confusion on the financial end as well. And there are fairly straightforward statutory expectations laid out for the financial industry. And as kind of pointed out in that final dot point, in particular for brokers and originators, those being brokers and originators who are licensed under the Residential Mortgage License Act. And that goes back to something that Moitha will be highlighting, but also that was the list in the FAQ, is it or is it not an exempt list, that the department links to their mortgage banking list. I think right now, as of this morning, there were 833 listed on that, and fairly straightforward, can be a Control F searchable screen. The recent warnings and enforcement, and the reason we're here, that's worth highlighting. In those top two, in particular in July, when the quote second notice was issued, dealt with, or in particular, I think is important for the industry to recognize, while there's a lot of areas of compliance and it's not the easiest of statutes, there's two particular things that the department has highlighted in their recent warnings and notices. The second one is, or the first one, as you see there, was from their second notice since May of 2020, 1,000 additional improper entity-based certificates of exemption were noted by the department. We're certainly looking at where and how issues have arisen. The list of 833 on the mortgage bank list that are not exempt is an important list, certainly to look for. There are going to be other ways that Moitha kind of points out the practical realities of it, but obviously IDFPR is highlighting that for the industry. It's also important, as we work through these things, to keep in mind that some of the ways that the industry can spot whether or not an entity is exempt may rely on the brokers and originators. And so it's also going to be important to hear from the industry in terms of what is or is not being done by the broker or originator industry that could maybe be changed in the future to help us, to help the title industry with compliance as well. So keep that in mind. The second one is a little bit more straightforward, but was worth highlighting because it showed up in both of the notices by IDFPR, and that's trying to avoid inaccurate, of course, but in particular altered or fabricated certificates of exemption. And this goes back to the explicit phrase of the statute that talks about forms that are generated by the database, in part because that's going to be in some ways easier thing for IDFPR to spot if the industry is not doing. And if there are times that this is happening more often, again, it's important to share that with the association so we're aware of and find out maybe why there's a need for changes or errors that the industry are seeing that would be delaying a transaction, because obviously we're trying to avoid delays in the transactions and trying to get through this as smooth as possible. And the last part is the phrase that highlights that from the warnings. When requesting a certificate of exemption, it's the responsibility of the person requesting the certificate to ensure the accuracy of the information submitted. That aspect of compliance is not going to go away anytime soon. It's something IDFPR has highlighted in both of their warnings. Some may have already seen it in cease and desist orders or audit requests. There may be frustration, certainly in the industry, in terms of a certain amount of responsibility being placed on the title industry. That's certainly something we want to look at for the future in terms of what is or is not properly within the scope of responsibilities. But for now, this is definitely an area the department's looking at. In many ways, the statute is explicit. And so hopefully, as Moitza walks through the practical aspects of this, will help get through the short term of compliance to avoid any larger problems. We'll also have a list of resources for everyone, and several of these Moitza is going to be getting into in particular to highlight as we go through. In the near term, on the final list, Catherine Liss, who's the director of the APLD, has generously offered to be available. Obviously, one person with many transactions going on in the 4 counties can only answer so many questions. Hopefully we'll be able to help with some of the questions people may have today, but at least in the near term, she has certainly indicated to be open to entertaining some of the more the larger questions that are happening in the industry in terms of an entity being exempt, a property being exempt, the uniqueness of private lending sometimes in a transaction, and trying to avoid some of the compliance problems that the department's been seeking enforcement on. With that, Moitza, I'm happy to turn it over to you for a walkthrough of the database and the application and exemption process.
Sounds good. Give me just a moment, everyone. Let me bring up my screen. Okay, so everything that Brian's talked about thus far leads me to what are the best practices for those of us that issue certificates, that work in the database. So what are the steps we need to do? And ironically, it's really simple. There's really only 2 things we need to do. Number 1, we need to determine which type of certificate should be issued. And then once we do that, we just need to issue it accurately. Sounds simple, doesn't it? And we know that it's not. It actually can be, it's a complicated process at times because there's so many different variables that can affect which certificate we issue and how we complete the process. So that's really what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of our time together. I'm not really going to focus on inputting all of the actual data step by step in the database. If you have questions on that, by all means, you're more than welcome to reach out to me, to anyone at ILTA, and we can help you with that. But we're going to really focus just on what are some of the best practices we can do in response to all of the things Brian's talked about thus far. So first thing I want to kind of address is, how do we determine and know which certificate we should issue? So I'm going to get you interacting with me here a little bit, my version of standing up and doing jumping jacks. Can I ask everybody to expand your question pane in the control panel? And once you expand the question pane in the control panel, can you type in there, how do you decide which certificate to issue? How do you decide which certificate to issue in the question pane? What are things you look for, things that help you to decide what certificate should be issued? So you're going to click on that orange grab tab, expand your control panel, and then you're going to down at the bottom, you're going to see the question pane. So I'm just going to read some things I'm seeing come up. We usually search for a social in the database. Is there a broker involved? Who's the originator? How do you decide which certificate to issue? That's the question, right? I look on the 1003 to see who's the loan originator. Oh, this one's funny. I ask Moitza. I review the database. I determine based on the type of property, the lender, the type of loan. All really, really good things on how we determine what type of certificate to issue. And when we're thinking through all these different things, I realize there's really two different ways we can determine which certificate to issue. And I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but this could be a good practice. So you could choose to first decide which certificate to issue based on looking at the transaction. What are the different qualifiers of the transaction? You could also choose to decide how to determine which certificate to issue by first looking at who's your loan originator and are they exempt from creating an application in the database. So you really can approach it from two different ways. Ultimately, you're going to get to the same answer, but you can approach it two different ways. So looking at the first way, if you first wanted to just look at your transaction, and maybe you're going to look to see, is my transaction a commercial property? Is it a government property? Or maybe it's a secondary residence, or I happen to know that it's a HELOC. So you can look at it from that perspective. Or again, if you're looking at the second version, you could choose to look for who's my lender, who's my loan originator, and are they exempt? So let's first look at this first scenario. When we're talking about the transaction itself. For example, when you're looking at something like, oh, it's commercial property, how do you know it's commercial property? Do you have supporting documentation so that if you were ever questioned, is this commercial property, you have something to be able to support why you chose commercial property? Same for government property. Government property somewhat might be easy to determine because you see who's the owner of the property. And again, if the owner is our government because it's a post office or it is a some federal office, then it's easy to be able to state it's a government office. But something you can't always assume that it's government property just based on the seller itself. For example, we might have situations where Housing and Urban Development, the U.S. HUD, is the seller. That doesn't necessarily, even though they own the property, that's not considered government property for APLD exemption purposes. So my best practice when you're choosing one of these exemption reasons, whether it's commercial, government, HELOC, investment, secondary residence, reverse mortgage, vacant land, it's always a good practice to have some type of supporting documentation to back that up. Something else to take note of is second mortgages. It's often that when you have, for example, especially a first and a second mortgage, it's easy. I mean, quite often we see that the second mortgage is a HELOC. So we tend to be quick to say, oh, well, I'm going to just attach an exempt certificate on my second mortgage and say it's a simultaneous HELOC. But you really do want to double check the mortgage itself. There are times a lender truly gives a standard second mortgage and not a HELOC for that second mortgage. And in that instance, that second mortgage would not qualify for an exempt certificate. It would need its own certificate of compliance. It would need a separate application in the database. So before choosing one of these options, you really want to just make sure you have supporting documentation to back that. Again, that was one of the big things that we were seeing on those memos, that we potentially, the mortgage itself might have required an exempt certificate from the database, but we might not have chosen, we meaning the industry, whoever it was that issued that certificate. I don't mean any one of us particularly on this call, but it's whoever issued the certificate might not have selected the correct exempt reason. So having that supporting documentation will help you decide that. So let's move on. Then we have the other instance, the instance of we're dealing with potentially deciding that I have an exempt lender I'm working with. But when we talk about exempt lenders, or when we're talking about a lender when it comes to APLD, we're not talking about who's funding the transaction. They state in one of their memos that the funder is irrelevant to APLD. The focus should always be on the originator of the loan. So my next question to all of you guys in the question pane is, how do you know who is your loan originator? When you're in a transaction, how do you know who is your loan originator? Go ahead and type in that question pane. Okay, I'm seeing some answers come in. So several of you are saying, I look on the 1003. And there we go. I also see somebody saying, I look on the 5th page of the CD. So more often than not, we do see the loan app, so we can determine there who was the loan originator, but we can also potentially be looking on the closing disclosure on that 5th page in the contact section. And from there, we can see who was, and from there, we can also see who was the loan originator. So both of those are really good places to start. So once you know who your loan originator is, how do you decide if that loan originator is exempt from creating an application? How do you decide? Go ahead and put that in the question pane. How do you decide whether your loan originator is exempt? So I got a few comments coming in. I look at the NMLS site. I look at the FFIEC site. What lender are they working for? I look at the IDFPR site. I look to see if they're a bank. I'm looking to see if the lender originates is part of a bank. So I see different. So we're looking at these. So yes, those are all different ways we can look. I was thinking the other day, I was like, so how did I'll be honest, I myself don't do as many closings as I did when I was managing an office. But I was thinking back, when I was doing this, how did I know whether someone was exempt or not? What are the different ways? What are the different resources that are available to us? And there's a few different ones out there, and these are not the only ones. There's many others you could choose to follow. But by all means, Brian mentioned earlier, there's the mortgage banking licensee list that the DFI is suggesting we use. Another way that I can right off the bat know whether somebody's exempt or not, I can actually try looking to see if there's an application in the database. Most lenders now, or I should say most loan originators today, know whether they should be doing this or not, whether they need to start an application in the database or not. Years ago, for those of us that were around when APLD first came out, really lenders were confused. They didn't know if they were supposed to start applications in the database or not. But this has been now in existence for several years, and most lenders do know whether they need to start an application. So I can proactively just see, is there an application in the system? If there is, then more often than not, I probably need to issue a certificate of compliance, which means my lender is not exempt. Another way we can look, is this a bank? Is this some kind of a depository institution? And then another option that's available to us, and we sometimes tend to forget, or it's at least not top of my mind, at least for myself, is the DFI themselves can give us guidance. When in doubt, I can always reach out to them, as Brian said, and they can provide us guidance as to whether this loan originator is exempt or not. So now let's really look a little bit closer at each of these different resources. So starting with the mortgage banking list. So from here, again, Brian was saying that if I went on the APLD Q&A, it gives us this link right here that we can go into to let us know if a lender is exempt or not. So I can come here and give me a moment. Here is that list. And what's really nice is right off the bat, if I Control F and I just start typing in the name of my lender I'm working with, and I'm just making this up as I go, but right off the bat, I can start typing in, and if the name appears, then that tells me that this lender is not exempt. This is a lender that should have an application in the database. So the certificate itself might still be exempt, but I should not choose exemption because it's an exempt entity. Maybe it's one of those other reasons we talked about a little bit ago. So that's one of my resources that is available to me. Looking at another, we talked about the application being right in the APLD website. I can at any point come in here and just see, is there an application? That's a great way to proactively confirm whether that lender even feels they should be exempt or not. Now, we do have to think about, though, as in our industry, and Brian and I were having this discussion the other day, we do have to think about our company's privacy policies. Although we might be privy to MPI, like a social security number, from the, whether we got it from a lender or we got it from a borrower, it doesn't necessarily, our privacy policy might actually restrict us from automatically sharing that in a third-party system. Yes, this is a regulatory requirement, but you got to go back and look at your privacy policy. What does your what are you and when are you allowed to use NPI that you've been given for other reasons, sharing it in something like this? So I'm just cautioning you, something to think about as part of your best practices. I'm not saying we shouldn't comply, but we have to make sure we also stay compliant with our privacy policies as well. But this is another resource that's available to us. So moving forward, what's another resource? Well, we were talking about banks. Well, certain banks are really obvious. If I think of Bank of America, Chase Morgan Bank, I mean, those are very obviously depository institutions, but there's many, many others that aren't as easy to know. Are they a bank? Are they chartered under a federally regulated entity, which makes them exempt from this or from having to start an application in the database? So how do I know that? Well, one option I have, again, in that same FAQ as Brian was telling us, they now included a link here to this. And if I go into that website, Let me pull that up. And again, one of our members earlier even recommended this. I can come here to the Federal Financial Institutions site, and I can type in the name of a lender. Now, again, this one's a little more obvious, but nonetheless, I'm going to go ahead and start typing in. I can type in Wells Fargo and search. Now, again, if a lender appears in this list, that tells me they're federally regulated. They do not need to be licensed under the Residential Mortgage License Act, and therefore they do not need to start an application. The other list we looked at a moment ago is a lender that does need to start an application. But if somebody's here, they do not. So now looking at this list, there is an awful lot of Wells Fargo. So maybe then I want to further break this down. And maybe I want to say Wells Fargo Bank. And now I see they're right here. And that they are an institution type, they are a national bank. So this is a great resource to use to help us identify that somebody is truly an exempt entity. One of the things that I shared with Brian, I actually shared with the DFI recently, is I find very difficult to determine sometimes when we're dealing with our private lenders, the hard money lenders. And in those instances, how do I know they don't need to be licensed under the Residential Mortgage License Act? I'm not going to find them here. They sure aren't federally regulated. So if you have a hard money lender, what is your option at that point? And that's for sure a great time that you can reach out to the DFI. Brian included a link to this. As a matter of fact, let me just pull up the entire document. Give me a moment. Oops, I think I had it a second ago. And here inside the document, they're letting us know exactly how we can request that a private lender is exempt. So this is their suggestion on how we can find out if a private lender is exempt from having to apply for an application. So saying all of that, those are the different ways those are the different tools I can use to determine, is my application or is my certificate going to be exempt, or am I going to be required to complete a full certificate of compliance? Once I've made that determination, then of course we get to the second step that I said at the beginning. Then we do have to then issue the certificate accurately. A few final things I want to mention on that part of it. Again, when you're issuing an exempt certificate, it is important that we enter the information here correctly as it's listed on our mortgage. If for some reason the mortgage changes, then technically we should just issue a new exempt certificate. I was saying earlier, they were very clear in those memos that we cannot be altering certificates. It's you can issue as many exempt certificates as if for some reason something changed, maybe my loan amount was going to be 300,000 and then they upped it to 310 during rescission. Okay, if that happens, it happens. We just then need to issue a new exempt certificate. And of course, if we're issuing a full certificate of compliance, it is important at that point that the information we're putting in the system is accurate. So I want to finish with that note that those are the do's and don'ts. How can, we can verify that the information we enter at that point. I had a situation just the other day where as we went into the database, and again, unfortunately, at this time, we all know if I'm here, I'm going to backtrack a moment. If I'm about to find an application, we currently, again, need to use that social security number. Well, as we entered the social security number that we were told was the correct social security number, we found out that there was no application. So we're on the phone with the loan originator. The loan originator is saying, I started an application, it's in there, only to realize the original application had the wrong social security number. So the quick and easy way to to finish this would be just using the incorrect social security number and entering the data and you're done. Unfortunately, that's not accurate. So the broker at that point did go back in and just opened up a new application themselves. I've also seen instances where, again, we've issued the certificate. It was something we needed for funding. So we issued the certificate only to find out the loan had to go back into underwriting for other reasons, and now they were changing the loan amount. Well, at that point, the original certificate's already been issued for a different loan amount. It's important at that point that, again, that loan originator just needs to go in and start a new application so that we can ultimately make sure that we are issuing the accurate certificate. So one best practice we try to do often is we try really hard to not issue the final certificate until we're close to the funding stage. We know many lenders require it for funding, but we try to at least review with the lender that everything else is good to go, that there isn't going to be any other changes required on a loan. For example, no names are going to change on the face of the mortgage. No middle initials are going to change. Because again, all of that is supposed to be accurate. So at that point, once we know everything else is good, then we generally try to issue the certificate. So that's a really good best practice there. So with that, Mike, I'm going to turn it now over to you for other questions that might have come in through the
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure. One question just came in, said, are you able to send out slides with the hot links that you're all talking about? We do have another version that didn't have the notes section, so you could take notes. We can send that out to everyone, so we can do that. I don't know, Maisa, there was one that said, please don't forget to mention that some are unaware of out-of-state lenders, brokers, see the exemption on the title and try to create their own certificate. We always reject those, but occasionally we have a loan package with a completed certificate in the package. Did you need to address that, or was that taken care of?
I would love to comment on that. Absolutely. It states in the regulation that if we are the settlement agent on the transaction, then it is our obligation to issue a certificate. So you will find, I recall, I don't see this as often, but I definitely saw this years ago, and you're right. Now we see it still occasionally with out-of-state lenders. We do, if somebody includes a certificate thinking they can issue it, if they did their own closing, if they recorded the mortgage on their own, then yes, lenders should issue their own certificate. But if we are acting as a settlement agent on a transaction, then it is our obligation. We are the ones responsible for making sure that that certificate is accurate. We should be issuing the certificate. So if somebody's including a certificate, I do let them know we cannot use that certificate. We need to issue it ourselves. And then again, verify, are they somebody who is exempt, or is it somebody that maybe needed to be registered as a residential mortgage licensee here in Illinois? They might be able to do business in another state, but that doesn't automatically allow them to do business in our state. So that's again where you might be looking at that exempt database, the FFIEC one that I was showing you earlier.
More questions are popping up, Maisa and Brian. Questions also, let's see here. I went into the FFIEC government NPW, not sure which link contains the list. We need to determine whether exempt.
Yeah, what a great one. Give me a second. Let me start over. I think it was right here. When you first come into this list, give me a moment. You want to click here on the bottom right, National Information Center. And this information is on the APLD in that FAQ that I was displaying earlier. They do state after they share this website address here, they say to click on the National Information Center, and that's how you will get to the search engine.
Okay, good. There's another one, or I think addressed that in the same different question, but same direction. Which link in the IDFPR mortgage bank has exemption list?
So in the IDFPR site, technically, this list is not who is exempt. This list is who is a mortgage licensee in Illinois, a loan originator in Illinois that is required to create an application in the database. So on the IDFPR site, we're not going to see an exempt list, just the opposite. We're going to see a list telling us who is supposed to create an application.
Okay, when a certificate has been recorded and we find out it's wrong, how do we correct it? Do we record a scrivener's affidavit?
That's a great question. And Brian, this might be one of those takeaways that we ask our department.
Okay, how do you get the FAQs on the APLD database?
Oh, be glad to show you. So when you come here, so when you first come into the IDFPR, this is their homepage. And, oh, I'm not there. Let me go back. Oh, I think I need to, I'm sorry. When you log in, you'll notice there is no FAQs. You need to log out. So the FAQs themselves sit on the generic, just ilapld.com website before you log in. They're right up here.
Okay. What institution types are allowed, and is there a list that is available?
Can you repeat that again, Mike?
It says, what institution types are allowed, and is there a list that we can have?
So what institution types are allowed? I'm assuming our audience member is asked, our ILTA member more specifically, is asking what institutions are exempt. I'm assuming that's what they're asking. So there, you know, Brian and I talked about this. There is no simple answer to that. The answer is almost reverse. You know, sometimes, how do you know it's red? Well, you know it's red when it's not any other. I mean, it's like if it's any other color, then you know it's not red. So the same thing kind of applies here. It's almost the negative. We know who should be starting an application in the database. Who should be starting an application in the database is a loan originator who falls under the definition of the Residential Mortgage License Act. I believe it's a lender who does 3 or more loans, a loan originator who does 3 or more loans in Illinois. Those, again, those that aren't a depository institution, those that aren't federally regulated. So this is like definitely one of the hardest things to determine is there one simple list? And there isn't. We have various options, and that's kind of why I was saying, how do you know somebody's exempt? You have to use different resources. One really good list, again, is this federal list, but it's not all inclusive. You might have somebody who only issues, is a private investor who only issues 1 loan a year. They would not technically need to be licensed in Illinois. The law doesn't require that. So, but how would you know that they only issued 1 loan this year? You wouldn't know that. So that's then when you have to go ahead and reach out to the state. So I think that's the $1 million question that we all struggle with. on the title side is we wish there was one exhaustive list. There isn't. We really kind of have a few things we have to look at, which is why on the PowerPoint we talked about, I know of at least 4 good venues or 4 resources that we can turn to help us determine that.
Along that line, Mike, so someone had asked if we had ever considered putting the information about who is exempt and not exempt on our website for easy reference instead of having to go to several different websites. Unfortunately, no. I think you answered it. That's not something, because trying to keep that current would be a difficult task. You unfortunately look at the other, you have to do your homework and go to these different sites to get a more exhaustive list. There was a question, it said, is the execution date on certificates supposed to be the date the borrower signed mortgage or the date the certificate was executed?
Give me a moment. Let's get back in here again. Let's pray I remember. There we go. If I'm here exempt, I was going to say, did it tell me here? Sometimes they have those info boxes. We have all, I believe it states in, and Brian, I don't know if you can find that quickly in the act. I believe it states that it's the date the mortgage is executed. And I believe there are several recorders that specifically look to make sure that that date matches with the date the mortgage is executed. But that might be something I prefer we follow up on.
There's
And I know we have some legal counsels on the call. If any of them happen to recall, maybe they could share.
Yeah, and again, we're not offering legal advice or representing the department or the association unless you need to contact your underwriter, legal counsel. To that end, there was a question. I don't understand how we comply with both our privacy policies and the APLD statute if the only way to look up an app is with a borrower's social security number. Is it something the state would be willing to correct? Use name, loan, number, address.
Ryan, do you want to take that question?
I would say this probably definitely falls under government relations. Sure. I mean, this is something I will at least note that early on was been brought up to the department. And Aaron, I see you made the note about the PINs. MOITA certainly has highlighted to the department about the history of at one time involving PINs, but not later on. Loan IDs and names have been other ways that have been brought up. I think this is definitely an important thing to look at because as you all work for the best compliance you can and check in the different spots, obviously an efficient way of searching is going to be important. Moita, if you wouldn't mind sharing the little bit of PIN history with the group, and certainly that has been brought up to the department. The other aspect that has been interesting is the department has access to the administrative level aspect of the database that maybe didn't translate initially in realizing that the title industry doesn't have access to all the things that the department has in terms of what can be searched. So I think they understand that and are at least open to suggestions.
Yeah, it's definitely a matter of conflict there for us. So the PIN number was something we used to be able to search by, and I know I would think most of us searched that way. What happened was the loan originators, mortgage brokers, they requested of the department that be changed in the regulation, because going back to a loan originator is supposed to start the application within 10 days of the loan app. But within 10 days of a loan app, they don't really know what the PIN number is, because that's not a loan originator's forte. That's not the type of information they know. They get that from our title commitments, and quite often they don't order the title commitment that early on in a transaction. So that's why the requirement was removed that a mortgage broker no longer had to enter a PIN number. So great for them that they don't have to enter the PIN number, but now you've put us in this position. So I was sharing with the DFI that couldn't we have either, as Brian alluded to, the department can look this up by the application number. And they thought we could as well. I'm like, what application number? I can see an application number once I'm in the record or once I'm in this application, but not initially. So they were like, oh, we didn't realize that. So that's one thing they're potentially looking at. And Brian will continue to have those discussions with them. But then the other suggestion I made was, or can we allow that maybe, although the PIN number isn't a required field for a loan originator, could at least it be there that a loan originator could add the PIN number, let's say once they get the commitment. So either we can ask the lender, give us your application ID number, or proactively just put in your PIN number and we'll search for it that way. So that's kind of where we're at. And but again, as Brian said, it's part of our continued discussions with them.
Several of the other questions are, kind of lean towards that as far as, and I know Brian can see the questions, as far as can't the APLD database create a default in their system? Can it, again, I think that falls under government relations when Brian has further discussions with the department on how or if the database can be streamlined to make it more effective for determining all of this information. So as we're getting close to actually over exceeding our time, but we wanted to try to answer as many of these questions. And there is a couple here that are best practice directed, at least. If the certificate is missing something such as a middle initial of a borrower or a directional in a property address that is shown on the MTG, but not the certificate, on the mortgage, but not the certificate, is it necessary to reapply for the certificate so all the info is precisely matches the mortgage?
The regulation is clear that it's supposed to be accurate.
There you go. Let's see. Why can't the DFI let us use the loan application number? We can get that from the lenders. Again, I think that is for further discussion with Brian and the department and looking at ILTA's needs for its membership. So hope for that. It says one final question: the certificate can be updated or corrected. I'm assuming that's a question, or is that a statement? But
it's a
statement. Can be updated.
There is a way that you can, and I'm not pulling it up because I need to be in an actual real application, and I don't want to share that MPI on the screen, but there is a way that as you get ready to issue the final certificate, let's say if they didn't have the middle initials in the application itself, as you get ready to print the certificate, you can add middle initials. You can add that directional to the street. So there is a field that was added to the database that allows you to do that as you get ready to print or issue that final certificate. So yes, you can catch that in most instances, but if you don't catch it, again, that's just sharing this. The regulation says it's supposed to match exactly.
Very good. Well, we have exceeded our hour allotment. Obviously, there's lots of questions. This topic is extremely important and timely since the department has issued some guidance in their emails that have gone out to all the agents and underwriters regarding the errors that are happening, and they'd like to get that taken down to a minimum. And obviously, for purposes of education, that's why we're doing this. If you have additional questions that have not been addressed, certainly send them to the ILTA, and we'll get them sent to Moisa or Brian as they begin to help us collect and decipher what types of things we can do with the department in hopes of making this better for everyone. We do thank the department for their accessibility in meeting with us prior to this and helping us to better understand where we're at with all this. So with that, I'm going to close out this event. I want to thank Moisa and Brian for this program. And again, thank you all for attending. I know this is a difficult time. Many of you are working remotely, and you may have children and other people accessing your Wi-Fi in your house, and makes you scatter things out all over different rooms and dining room tables and such. But you're all doing a fantastic job. We're really proud of the ILTA members and how they're dealing with all this. So thank you very much, Moisa and Brian. And with that, we will end this session.